Can a single napkin, with just a few trembling words scribbled on it, change the fate of an entire restaurant? Lucas Graham stepped through the heavy wooden doors of Harborwood Bistro, his old wool coat covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had followed him across miles of road. He lowered his head slightly, letting the brim of his cap hide his eyes so no one would recognize him as the true owner of this place, the man who had once turned a nameless chain of restaurants into a multi-million-dollar empire. But tonight, Lucas was not a billionaire. He was Evan Reed, a weary traveler, arriving here as just another passerby stopping at a roadside eatery. His steps were slow, deliberate, blending into the noisy crowd like a shadow no one cared to notice. The warm yellow light from the hanging ceiling lamp spilled in patches across the old wooden floor, revealing scratches only someone who had once scrubbed these floors with their own hands would recognize. Lucas chose a table tucked away in the far corner, where the leather seat was cracked and peeling with age, a spot where he could observe everything without drawing attention. The air inside carried a warmth heavy with the mingling scents of melted butter, roasted garlic sauce, and something faintly rancid from old frying oil. A troubling sign for someone who knew this industry as well as he did. But what unsettled Lucas most was not the smell. It was the atmosphere. Customers still chatted, still laughed, but the air was weighed down by something invisible. The staff moved quickly and quietly, no one smiling with their whole face. Lucas saw it, as if an entire room full of people was wearing masks to hide something deeper, fear, exhaustion, or quiet despair. His gaze shifted toward the cashier counter, where a tall man stood with slicked-back hair shining as if coated with wax, arms crossed, his cold eyes scanning every employee. That had to be Victor Sloan, the manager mentioned in the reports. The man suspected of driving employee turnover rates through the roof. Lucas's eyes lingered as Victor leaned in close to a young dishwasher, his lips tight, spitting words that Lucas couldn't hear but could read in the boy's reaction. The boy lowered his head, shoulders trembling, his hands gripping the wet tray so tightly his knuckles whitened. A slow burn of anger rose in Lucas's chest, but he held it back, his expression remaining that of an indifferent stranger. He had lived through days like this himself, had felt the crushing helplessness of being berated by a cruel manager. And now he was back, not for revenge, but to expose the ones hurting the very people who reminded him of who he once was. Tonight, Lucas Graham was not just another customer. Tonight, he was a storm waiting to break. Lucas leaned back against the chair, his gaze seemingly drifting lazily across the chatting guests. But in truth, every small detail in the room was falling neatly into his line of observation. A young waitress walked slowly toward a nearby table, the tray in her hands trembling slightly with each step. Her name was Clara Hayes. He knew this from the faded, crooked name tag pinned to her chest. Her brown hair was hastily tied back with a thin, elastic band, a few loose strands falling over her eyes, which might have been beautiful if they weren't now clouded with exhaustion. The smile she gave as she set the dish down looked perfect, soft, and practiced. But to Lucas, a man who had read hundreds of the subtle expressions of employees under his leadership, it was an empty smile, heavy with worry. As she turned to head back toward the kitchen, he caught the quick glance she shot at the small office in the corner of the restaurant where Victor Sloan stood, his chin tilted arrogantly, his cold eyes as sharp as a butcher's knife. That glance wasn't curiosity, it was fear, the instinctive reaction of someone who knew they were being watched, like prey tensing just before the predator strikes. Lucas tilted his head slightly, pretending to sip his water to hide the intensity of his scrutiny. He noticed how Clara's steps slowed as she passed the cashier counter, her shoulders drawing in slightly when Victor's gaze swept in her direction. That posture restrained, weighed down, reminded Lucas of himself years ago, when he had to grit his teeth and endure humiliation over a minor mistake during a shift. He narrowed his eyes, a flicker of unease stirring in his chest. In good restaurants, employees smiled with genuine warmth, their eyes reflecting pride in their work. But here, every smile felt like a thin mask, hiding something far more troubling than a bad quarterly report. He suddenly realized the atmosphere inside Harborwood Bistro was like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding, and Victor was the hand tightening the valve. Lucas set his glass down, his expression hardening. He knew there were things no financial report would ever reveal, but people always did if you knew how to look closely. And tonight, he wasn't here just to observe. He was here to expose every secret buried beneath this facade of perfect customer service. Clara returned to Lucas's table carrying a tray of fragrant dishes, carefully setting the plate of salmon in front of him. Her smile was soft, like a passing breeze, but it wasn't enough to hide the nervous glance she shot toward the office where Victor stood. "Enjoy your meal," she said gently, her voice smooth but slightly trembling, as if every word had been weighed carefully to avoid drawing attention. Lucas nodded slightly, maintaining the role of an ordinary stranger. But in the moment Clara turned away, he caught a movement so quick that anyone less observant would have missed it. Her fingers slid briefly under the plate, leaving something behind. Lucas waited a few seconds, careful not to appear too eager, before lifting the plate as if he were just checking whether the salmon was evenly cooked. His fingers brushed the edge of a hastily folded napkin, still damp, proof it had just been tucked there. He slid it out from under the plate and discreetly unfolded it beneath the table, his movement so subtle that no one around noticed. The words appeared before him, scribbled in rushed, uneven handwriting, but sharp enough to cut through his composure like a blade. "He's stealing from us. Please, help." Beneath that, written in smaller, almost desperate letters, was a second plea. "Please don't let him know I told you." Lucas tightened his grip on the napkin, his eyes darkening. A surge of anger and bitter resolve filled his chest. Clara had risked everything by passing this to him, and she had done it because, despite his disguise, she had sensed something different about him. Maybe it was the calm in his eyes, or perhaps the way he had been studying every detail in the restaurant, the eyes of a man who hadn't come here just to eat. He looked up, watching Clara as she moved briskly between tables, her hands steady on the tray, but her shoulders slightly trembling, as if she were carrying an invisible ticking bomb. Lucas exhaled slowly, setting the plate back into its exact position, his expression returning to that of an indifferent customer. But inside, a decision had already been made. That napkin was not just a cry for help, it was a death sentence for the ones destroying this place. And he would be the one to deliver the verdict. That night, Lucas didn't return to his luxurious apartment as he usually did. Instead, he sat inside a dark-colored car parked silently a few blocks away from Harborwood Bistro, the engine off, but his mind working like a machine running at full capacity. Inside the car, the cold blue glow from his laptop screen carved sharp lines across his face. His eyes were no longer those of an ordinary customer, but of a predator tracking its prey. He accessed the restaurant's surveillance system, a privilege only the true owner could have. The footage sped by quickly, stopping abruptly whenever something unusual caught his attention, and piece by piece, the ugly truth revealed itself, forming a picture filthier than he had imagined. Victor Sloan appeared on the screen like a smug predator ruling his territory. In one clip, he slipped tip money into his jacket pocket when he thought no one was watching, the corner of his mouth curling into a cocky grin. In another, he signed an employee's time card to mark the end of their shift, then forced them to keep working 2 more hours unpaid. Lucas slowed the footage when a scene made his hand tighten into a fist so hard his knuckles cracked. Victor was in the walk-in freezer, his face flushed red as he pointed a finger directly at Clara, shouting so loudly that even the camera microphone caught every crude word. Clara stood hunched, clutching the edge of her apron, tears streaking down her cheeks as she lowered her head, trying to make herself invisible to escape his wrath. Leaning closer to the screen, Lucas's eyes glinted with a cold, controlled fury. He scrolled through more clips, each one worse than the last terrified glances, weary shrugs of resignation as employees passed Victor, and quick, hateful glares barely hidden behind forced obedience. Harborwood Bistro was no longer a restaurant, it was an invisible prison, and Victor was its warden. Lucas stopped the footage, leaning back in his seat, his eyes locked on the screen as if staring directly at his enemy's face. A cold smile flickered across his lips, not from satisfaction, but from certainty. Victor believed he could manipulate everything in the dark, but he was wrong. From this moment forward, that darkness would be the very thing that consumed him. Lucas sat motionless in his car for a long time, his eyes fixed on the now black screen after shutting the laptop. In the heavy silence of the night, he could hear his own breathing, slow, measured, tightly controlled. Inside him, anger didn't burn like fire. It moved beneath the surface like molten lava, simmering, restrained, and far more dangerous. He leaned back against the seat, his gaze drifting through the windshield toward the restaurant still faintly glowing in the distance, like a predator watching its prey from the shadows. A memory resurfaced, sharp enough to sting a 17-year-old boy with calloused hands, standing at a greasy sink in a cramped kitchen, humiliated as a manager hurled an entire plate of food in his face for dropping a single glass. That helpless shame had carved itself deep into his heart, sealing a silent vow. If he ever held power, he would never allow anyone to endure the same. And now he saw pieces of himself in Clara Hayes's trembling eyes, in the thin shoulders of the young dishwasher Victor had barked at, in the forced smiles of staff who hid tears behind the kitchen doors. The financial losses, the stolen money, none of that mattered anymore. Harborwood Bistro was no longer just a brand. It was a place filled with people being crushed, and that insulted every value Lucas had fought to build. He drew in a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment before opening them again, his gaze turning cold and resolute. Slowly, he placed a hand over his jacket pocket where Clara's napkin, carefully folded, rested. That fragile piece of paper was not just a plea for help, it was a sentence handed down. Lucas would not simply punish Victor for stealing. He would strip away the mask the man wore, exposing him in front of every employee he had intimidated, and in front of every customer who believed this was a safe, trustworthy restaurant. Lucas lifted his head slightly, his eyes glinting like the edge of a blade as they fixed on the yellow light spilling from Bistro's windows. He knew that by morning this place would never be the same again, and Victor Sloan would never forget the moment he was forced to meet the eyes of those he had terrorized and see the truth of who he really was reflected back at him. Tonight, Lucas had made a vow, and he was not a man who broke his word. By noon the next day, Harborwood Bistro looked as lively as ever. Customers came and went, the steady clinking of cutlery against porcelain filling the air. But no one in the restaurant realized that in just a few moments, the calm facade would shatter completely. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Lucas Graham stepped inside no longer wearing the worn-out cap and frayed jacket of Evan Reed. Instead, he wore a fitted black shirt, sharp-tailored trousers, polished leather shoes, and carried himself with the unmistakable authority of a man who had built and commanded an entire empire. Following closely behind him were two lawyers in dark suits, each carrying thick document cases. Lucas's footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, each one sounding like a drumbeat announcing the coming of a storm. Victor Sloan stood near the cashier counter, frowning as he adjusted a tablecloth, his voice cold and clipped as he barked at a young employee for leaving a spoon slightly out of place. Hearing the approaching footsteps, he looked up, hesitating for a fraction of a second at the sight of the man walking toward him, but quickly tried to regain his composure. "May I help?" His words died in his throat as Lucas placed a tablet firmly on the counter. With a flick of his finger, the screen lit up, casting a cold glow across Victor's face. "You won't need to," Lucas said, his voice low, steady, carrying an authority no one could challenge. "But I think everyone here will want to see this." The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to slow, conversations pausing as curious customers turned to look. Victor froze, his face draining of color as he stared at the video playing on the screen, himself slipping tip money into his jacket pocket, eyes darting nervously as he smirked in triumph. Another clip showed him screaming inside the walk-in freezer, finger jabbing in Clara's face as harsh insults poured from his mouth, Clara standing trembling, tears streaking her cheeks, while the other employees averted their eyes like frightened children cowering from a whip. A ripple of murmurs swept through the dining area, a few servers stopping mid-task, staring wide-eyed at the screen. Lucas looked up, his gaze locking onto Victor with the weight of a final verdict. Victor Sloan, you're fired, effective immediately. His words weren't loud, but they struck like thunder, carrying through the entire restaurant. Victor's mouth fell open, his face flushed red, then turned pale as his eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for a way out. But surrounded by furious and disgusted stares, there was no escape. He stood frozen, stammering incoherently, unable to form a single defense. Lucas didn't waver, his eyes cold and unyielding. In that moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Justice had begun to take its course, and Victor Sloan would never again hold power in this place. The room that had been buzzing with murmurs just moments ago now fell into an almost eerie silence. Victor Sloan stood frozen by the cashier counter, his face pale, while the employees quietly gathered around, every pair of eyes locked on Lucas Graham, the true owner of Harborwood Bistro. Lucas slowly turned away from Victor, stepping to the center of the room, his voice warm yet firm, carrying enough strength for everyone to hear clearly. "I've seen what's been happening here, and I can't stay silent for another second." His gaze swept over each face, eyes that had grown used to fear, but now glimmered with the faintest spark of hope. Lucas stopped, his attention landing on Clara Hayes, the young woman standing near the kitchen door, gripping a serving tray as if it was the only thing keeping her steady. She stared at him wide-eyed, her face paling slightly, as if she had just realized something. Lucas gave her a small smile, the first one since this tense confrontation had begun, and spoke with genuine sincerity. "I couldn't have done this without someone who was braver than anyone else in this room, someone who risked her job, maybe even her own safety, just to speak the truth." He walked toward Clara slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Clara instinctively took a small step back, her hands trembling, but Lucas simply nodded, confirming his words with a steady voice. "Clara Hayes, you are the real hero here." The room filled with hushed murmurs as employees turned to look at Clara, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Clara shook her head slightly, her eyes glistening with tears, her lips quivering. I just did what anyone should have done." Lucas leaned slightly toward her, his tone soft but unwavering. "No, Clara. Very few have the courage to do what you did. And I won't let that courage go to waste." He turned to face all the employees, his voice now ringing out strong and resolute. "Starting today, every cent that was stolen from you will be returned with added compensation. We're also creating a mental health support fund for every employee because no one should have to work in fear the way you have." Lucas looked back at Clara, his eyes softening, as if making her a promise. "And Clara Hayes," he paused for a moment, letting the entire room hold its breath. "Effective immediately, you are the new assistant manager of Harborwood Bistro. This isn't just a reward, it's recognition for a truly brave heart." A round of applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling into a wave of cheers. Clara stood frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. Lucas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his smile full of pride. "Thank you for believing this place could be better." A week later, Harborwood Bistro felt like an entirely different place. The heavy tension that once lingered in the air was gone, replaced by laughter spilling from the kitchen, lively conversations among staff, and words of praise from satisfied guests. The warm atmosphere was so palpable that anyone who stepped through the door could feel the change immediately. Golden light from the hanging lamps reflected off tables polished to a perfect shine, and the smell of toasted bread blended with buttery garlic drifted through the air like a welcoming embrace. Lucas Graham sat at a corner table, this time not to hide but to observe openly. He wore a simple white shirt with sleeves rolled up, his leather shoes modest compared to the ones he wore in boardroom meetings. He wanted to look like someone who belonged here, and today, he truly did. Holding a cup of hot coffee, Lucas took a slow sip, his eyes following Clara Hayes as she directed operations at the front desk. She was no longer the young woman with a forced smile and worried eyes. Now, Clara stood tall, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes bright with confidence as she guided new staff members. Her smile was real this time, natural and radiant. and Lucas found himself smiling without even realizing it. From the kitchen came the sound of chefs laughing while they worked, their voices filled with ease instead of fear. A young dishwasher hurried past, soap bubbles still clinging to his hands, his eyes sparkling with excitement, a stark contrast to the terror he wore just a week ago. Around the dining room, guests praised the service enthusiastically. An elderly couple whispered to each other about the remarkable transformation, and the husband nodded approvingly, speaking just loud enough for Lucas to hear. This place, it finally feels like a family restaurant again. Lucas felt those words like a quiet confirmation of everything he had fought for. He knew true change didn't come from simply firing a greedy manager. It came from giving these people back their belief that their work mattered. Leaning back in his chair, Lucas's eyes lingered on Clara once more. She was smiling as she gently guided a new staff member on how to carry a tray properly, her hand resting encouragingly on his shoulder. Watching that moment, Lucas knew he had made the right choice. Harborwood Bistro hadn't just been revived. It had come back to life, its soul rekindled by the courage of a young woman and the faith he had placed in the people who called this place their own. Lucas Graham did not leave the restaurant immediately after witnessing its newfound energy and life. For several days he chose to stay during the quieter hours, sitting with employees and speaking with them one by one, as if he wanted to truly understand the people who had helped bring about this change. He was no longer the mysterious owner who only appeared to make decisions but had become someone who listened genuinely. He sat next to Javier, the young dishwasher with calloused hands, the same boy Lucas had once seen trembling under Victor's scolding. Javier spoke with eyes full of hope, telling Lucas how he was saving every penny to send back home to his aging mother, and that now it feels worth it because at least we're respected. Lucas nodded slightly, saying little, but his eyes reflected deep empathy. In another corner, Nina, the slender waitress, smiled shyly as she admitted she had started saving money to study nursing, because, as she said, when the real boss cares about his employees, it makes me want to do something good for others too. Lucas listened to every word and his heart warmed, because this was the true meaning of building a business, giving people the chance to dream. But the conversation that moved him the most was with Clara Hayes. In the late afternoon, after the last customers had left, she sat across from Lucas at a table near the window, where the soft golden light of the setting sun caught her brown hair, making it glow gently. Clara smiled, but her voice trembled slightly as she spoke about the night she wrote those desperate words on the napkin. I didn't know if I would lose my job or even face retaliation, but I thought if I didn't do something, things would only get worse. I don't even know why I trusted you the moment I saw you, but your eyes that night, they weren't like any other customers. Lucas remained silent for a moment, looking straight at her, his eyes serious yet warm. Finally he spoke, his voice steady and filled with sincerity. Because I've been where you were, and maybe that's why I couldn't turn away. In that moment, Lucas realized that real change doesn't come from boardroom decisions or clever business strategies. It comes from trust, the kind Clara had placed in him during a desperate moment. That trust had passed to him, and now it was spreading throughout this restaurant, like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. That evening, Harborwood Bistro glowed under the warm, golden lights, its glass windows reflecting the bright faces of employees and the satisfied smiles of customers. Lucas Graham stood outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, quietly watching like a passer-by who had stopped for a moment. He didn't go in, nor did he need to intervene anymore, because this place now stood strong on its own, built on the unity and trust everyone had placed in one another. Back at his office, Lucas sat down at his desk, loosening his tie as his hands gently opened a drawer. Inside, carefully placed in a small glass frame, was the wrinkled napkin with hurried scrawls. He's stealing from us. Please help. Below it, in smaller letters, shaky with desperation, read, Please, don't let him know I said anything. Lucas stared at it for a long moment, and a faint smile appeared on his lips, not the triumphant smile of a victorious businessman, but the quiet smile of a man who had found himself again. Leaning back in his chair, his gaze turned thoughtful. Memories came rushing back the years he had endured injustice, the late nights after grueling shifts, hands blistered and raw, still forcing a polite smile through insults. He had once promised himself he would never let anyone under his leadership feel that way, but he had almost forgotten that promise, consumed by numbers and cold reports. This napkin, fragile, insignificant enough to be overlooked like a scrap of paper, had reminded him why he started all this in the first place. Not just to make money, but to build a place where people were respected, protected, and could believe in a better future. He placed a hand gently on the glass frame, whispering almost to himself, just one small plea for help, but enough to change everything. In his mind appeared the image of Clara standing confidently at the front desk, her fear replaced by a genuine smile, the hopeful eyes of Javier, Nina, and the other employees, people who could now hold their heads high at work. Harborwood Bistro was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a living proof that fairness still existed, that courage still mattered, and that one person brave enough to speak out could change an entire community. Outside the window, the night sky shimmered with stars. Lucas stood, switching off the office light, but before leaving, he glanced one last time at the napkin, his eyes resolute. One small piece of paper had changed the fate of a restaurant, and perhaps it had changed him as well. Just one small act of courage is enough to ignite hope and change an entire community. That is the greatest value any organization should protect. If you also believe that fairness begins with the simplest things, hit like and subscribe to help us share more inspiring stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words faith and courage, because it is faith and courage that have written this ending.